at GW. We are, at a fairly, we are a fairly large community, actually. So, but sometimes we don't all get together because there's a lot of people who do policy. But today we have somebody who's doing something much more in the social, cultural, and humanities. And we're also, I should say, we're the only National Resource Center for East Asia Studies in the entire Washington area. And we have a thriving and big Taiwan studies program. So with all that as background, we have the perfect speaker today. And let me introduce the speaker, Christine Lin, as well as our moderator from GW, and then I will hand it over to them. Okay, so just a quick introduction. Christine Lin, the speaker, she's going to be talking about a coalescing Taiwanese American identity and U.S. Taiwan relations. I should tell you that she's doing this in spite of a day job where she is a well-known international human rights lawyer, works on refugees and migrants and so forth. But this is what she describes as her passion project. And so that's saying a lot for her commitment to this. She's currently a non-resident visiting scholar at the Sigur Center, and she is researching the role of Taiwanese American identity and U.S. Taiwan relations. And she has earlier published on Taiwanese American political views in the U.S. and the status of Taiwan. And to help moderate and comment on her talk, we have Jonathan Sigur, who is Associate Professor of English at GW. He's also an affiliated faculty at Sigur Center's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. He's the author of a very interesting book called Anti-Racist Medievalisms, From Yellow Peril to Black Lives Matter. So with that very interesting background to both the speakers today, my pleasure to welcome Christine to the podium.
Oh, very goodness. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Sigur Center. I really want to thank Richard Haddock for organizing this and actually helping me get the non-resident scholar position at the Sigur Center, and Jonathan Chu for advising me on this project. So I'm going to just kind of give you a quick background of who I am, just so you know where I'm coming from, since this project is on Taiwanese American identity. So I am Taiwanese American. I have always identified that way. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. My middle name, as you can see here, is Louise, because I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. And I grew up in a small town on this map here on the edge of Illinois called Alton. It is 0.2% Asian, and there were 3 Taiwanese families. And it's about 75% white, 25% Black, and less than 1% everything else. So that's kind of my background and the perspective I'm coming from. My family belongs to the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church of Greater St. Louis, and then also the Taiwanese Association of America of Greater St. Louis. I spoke, for those of you who do know Taiwanese, I spoke Dai or Taiwanese, and I'm going to refer to that as Taiwanese Hokkien in the survey. At home, we didn't speak Mandarin Chinese, although I did study that in college. My family is more pro-Taiwan independence. This was the flag in our house. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and any lenses that I might be approaching this survey. I am trying to take a holistic approach though, but I just want to share that with everyone so you know my background. So the research methodology for this project is, in 2017, I did a survey of self-identified Taiwanese Americans on their political views and the status of Taiwan, and I also had some questions in there about Taiwanese identity. So some of the survey results here are from that study as well, and that was more of a narrative response from folks. And then in June 2022, I launched this English survey for self-identified Taiwanese Americans on identity. And then I was talking to Jonathan, he was like, why don't you do a Mandarin survey too? So then I translated it into Mandarin. My Mandarin is not like 100% there. So that was kind of challenging for me. But in November of 2022, I did translate the survey into Mandarin and disseminated that. Then I've also been looking at resources on intergenerational trauma, transitional justice, looking at media sources discussing Taiwanese and Taiwanese American identity, because there are overlaps. And then I do plan to interview some of the survey respondents, Taiwan scholars, U.S. policymakers, and media reporting on Taiwan and U.S. foreign policy. I haven't gotten to all of that yet, because this is outside of my day job. So this is kind of where I am, is I'm collecting some survey responses, and these are my preliminary findings. For those of you who are interested in the survey, I have the English and Mandarin. Here are the QR code links to them if you are interested. I can also share this with folks later on, and I try to put it on social media. But please feel free to share widely. I'm keeping the survey open for now indefinitely. I feel like I'm just trying to get the word out about the survey. I've pushed it out mostly to Taiwanese American organizations, social media, but I'm not on all social media platforms. So some of the responses are a little bit limited. I did want to just note the term Chinese and the English and the Mandarin are a little bit different. So in English, Chinese is just Chinese. But in the Mandarin version, there is a distinction between the word Dongguoren, person from the country of China, and Huaren, person of Chinese ethnicity. So I do use those nuances a little bit differently in the Mandarin survey in the questions, but otherwise, except for this, the questions are the same. So I have received 685 responses from self-identified Taiwanese Americans so far, and 446 took the English survey and 239 took the Mandarin survey. And then I thought it was interesting too to see where people were born. And in the presentation today, I'm presenting it in the English survey responses, the Mandarin survey responses, and in some cases too, I'm presenting the combined data, just because there are some interesting data points. So in the English survey, you can see about 58% were born here, born in Taiwan, 40% in the US. In the Mandarin survey, not surprisingly, 96% born in Taiwan and just 3%, 6 people, born in the United States, and then a few people in other places. The total responses by country of birth, interestingly, 71% were born in Taiwan, 27% in the United States, but they say they self-identify as Taiwanese American. All right, so just to kind of give the breakdown by how old people are, I did it in decades because I felt like that was the easiest way to represent it. So anywhere from like somebody born in the 1930s to I have a few folks who are born in this millennium. But this is kind of the breakdown in English. You can see in the Mandarin survey responses that it skews a little bit older. Don't have anybody born in the 90s and just one person who was born in 2002. Also not surprising, given that most of this was disseminated here to self-identified Taiwanese Americans. And this is just kind of the combined survey, so you can see the breakdown of ages. But I have survey respondents from anywhere from 1930 to about 2011. I asked in the survey what language people spoke predominantly at home, outside the home, what was seldom spoke at home, but was spoken, or was spoken at home equally with another language. And the language choices were English, Mandarin, Taiwanese Hokkien, Dai, Hakka, which is another language that folks speak in Taiwan, as well as any indigenous languages. This is the English survey response. I think actually the combined language kind of gives more insight. Here you can see that the language predominantly spoken at home for the most survey respondents was actually Taiwanese Hokkien, and then outside English, and then some Mandarin as well. But Mandarin was also predominant language spoken for many others, much less in terms of Hakka and indigenous languages. This was an interesting question. I wanted to know how many people always had identified as Taiwanese American. And I was, to be honest, kind of surprised by the numbers of always, given that the country of birth for most people was Taiwan. So 82% in the English survey said that they always identified as Taiwanese American, 209 in the Mandarin survey. So I do feel like, and this is kind of the combined data, I do feel like there was some conflation with Taiwanese. Have you always identified as Taiwanese and always identify it as Taiwanese American? And then I kind of broke the survey down further to ask what factors cause you to embrace your Taiwanese identity and what part the American identity. So for the American identity, can anybody think what would be factors that influences one's American identity? In the survey, I actually gave, sample responses that people could check off. And then there was an open-ended other two that people could write in. But what? Lack of ability to interact with a culture for American identity. Okay. And I think I'm going to show the data first for like American identity. So what kinds of things do you think, like speaking English might be something that people would think that they're American, growing up in America? Food choices? That's a good one.
I think this is a part of your life.
Your life.
Like you live there forever.
Yeah.
It's just when people ask, where are you from? I'm from DC,
Yeah.
Who are you? I'm American. That's just the way it is, isn't it?
Yeah, good. So all great responses. So interestingly, in the English survey, people said U.S. citizenship was actually their #1 factor for the American identity. And then I broke it down into the different factors. So, and you all hit on some of these. Education in America, culture, proficiency in English, American values, some people's immigration to the United States, that are raised here, born here, American food, traditions, religious practices, and at least a parent identifies as American is kind of lower on the scale. And then the Mandarin one was interesting in that there was a slight nuance of difference in that their immigration to the United States kind of helped them embrace American identity. And for some people, they did actually say that just becoming a lawful permanent resident in the United States didn't have to be citizenship, made them feel more American and just being here in America. And so this is kind of the breakdown, and you can see it's a little bit different than the English ones. And then this is the combined one, but the top combined answer is the US citizenship, and then American culture, education, immigration, American values, English. Oh, I gave it away. I was gonna ask, what did you think for Taiwanese identity? And I was actually really surprised, I will say, that Taiwanese food was the #1 factor of survey respondents for Taiwanese identity. But then now I think about it and I'm like, you know what? Actually, that's a great way for people to identify. And Jonathan and I have been discussing this, and we're like, that's actually a soft power way of embracing one's identity that is not politicized, but what one's, interest in food is. And then those 3 pictures up there are from my last trip to Taiwan, of some of my favorite foods, and I went to a night market. Anyway, and then I think it's really interesting here too, like there's been a surgence in the United States of Taiwanese American food, and distinctly called Taiwanese American food, or just more like night markets in Taiwan. Boba. I went to this Bay Area boba event a couple weeks ago. And then one of our radio stations put together a whole list of eating Taiwanese food in the Bay Area. So you're seeing that a lot. And then also in New York, there's been a lot of restaurants that are Taiwanese. In terms of, so this is kind of the breakdown: Taiwanese food, belief in Taiwanese self-determination, ancestors in Taiwan prior to 1949, sorry. at least one parent identifying as Taiwanese, cultural practices. I won't go through all of the list. So interestingly, in Mandarin, it's a little bit different. The factors influencing one's Taiwanese identity was food is much lower. You can see in the Mandarin respondents, and they're being raised in Taiwan, born in Taiwan, educated in Taiwan. But belief in Taiwanese self-determination is here too. But the combined survey results, you'll see that actually self-determination comes in the top reason for factors that influence people's identity. And for this survey, people could choose multiple responses. That's why it's not that all equal. But I thought that was interesting. So belief in Taiwanese self-determination is a factor influencing Taiwanese identity, and then food, and being born in Taiwan, and then ancestors and all of that. So that was interesting. And then contrary to the American identity, the holding a passport and Taiwanese citizenship is not as important. It's way further down the line for somebody's Taiwanese identity. And then I also asked, if you didn't previously identify as Taiwanese American, what did you identify as? And so some folks said that they identified as Chinese American, only Taiwanese. They didn't understand the history of Taiwan. It was easier not to mention it because people hadn't heard of Taiwan. They only identified as Chinese and American. And there's some narrative answers that I will break that down later on. And then some of the reasons why they didn't identify as Taiwanese American before the Mandarin survey. So this is where you see the nuances of the Chinese. They previously only identified as Zhongguoren, which is a person from China. And then lower down, they previously only identified as Huaren, so a person of Chinese ethnicity versus being a person from that country. And then this is just kind of like the various iterations. I won't go into these in as much detail. But some people I asked, what impacted your kind of shift to a Taiwanese American identity? And people mentioned the Taiwanese American Citizens League, the Taiwanese American Professionals, Taiwanese American Association of America, or the Taiwanese Association of America, and then various cultural festivals. I am actually on the board of the Taiwanese American Professionals in San Francisco. It's kind of a recent thing I've been involved in. And I would say there, the thing that bonds people is food and boba, not politics. In fact, I try to talk about politics, and people are like, well, we don't want to talk about that at all. And then, in terms of what impacts their identity evolution, more understanding of the personal, geopolitical, and Taiwanese history, reading books by Taiwanese authors. Some thought Taiwanese and Chinese were the same because they were educated in Taiwan, but they learned more about the history of Taiwan after coming to the United States. Some folks spent time in China and then realized that there was a cultural gap between China and Taiwan, and then between people who were descendants of people with long histories in Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. And then there was some folks that wanted to distinguish themselves from the People's Republic of China. And then others who want to spread more of an awareness of Taiwan as a nation. And then Mandarin, a lot of these are also, similar factors as well. But there was a lot more language about feeling like they were brainwashed, lied to before they came to the United States and then learned about things. Or after immigrating to the United States, one person says they realized that Zhongguoren refers to people from the People's Republic of China, not the Republic of China. And then sometimes some people thought some of the Chinese missile threats in 1996 and onwards kind of made them feel different from Chinese. And then I asked how many of these folks who identify as Taiwanese American also identify as Chinese. In the English survey, 75% do not, and about 25% do. And then in the Mandarin, kind of a similar breakdown, 70% don't, slightly higher, 29.6% do. Again, this is a little bit different because this question was asked as ethnic Chinese versus someone who's Dongguoren from the country of China. And then factors in influencing Chinese identity. So the English survey respondents love food. Chinese food is like another reason again, and then proficiency in Mandarin, Chinese cultural practices, traditions, having family who fled mainland China, but they KMT in the 1940s, Confucian values, and those factors. And then for the Mandarin survey, the factors influencing Chinese identity were proficiency in Mandarin actually was the top piece, and the Confucian values, their birthplace, where they were educated, cultural practices, Chinese food is further down this list. And then combined is the proficiency in Mandarin, Chinese food, cultural practices, traditions. So why, I also wanted to know why are some of these folks embracing a Chinese identity? And so I've included some of these quotes. I won't go through all of them, but I think the common theme is some people feel like they can't deny that their ancestors were originally from mainland China. So they do embrace a Chinese ethnic identity, even if they don't think that Taiwan and China politics are the same. But there's more nuances in these quotes. I just pulled out a few of these. And then, some people are saying, it's foolish not to recognize that Chinese identity is a part of Taiwanese identity. And then somebody else also said that it bothers them immensely when Taiwanese people and Taiwanese Americans deny that they're Chinese. Obviously, I want nothing to do with the PRC or the CCP, and I fully embrace Taiwanese national identity and political identity. But I think as Taiwanese people, we can still recognize our lineage and participation in the long 4,000-year history of Chinese culture. And the idea of Huaren, the Chinese ethnicity, exists for that reason. And then this was one viewpoint, is there is only one China, and that is the Republic of China. Both the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, and the Chinese Communist Party are radical leftists who should be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. I got one of these responses too in my 2017 survey, but I would say the minority view is not that the ROC should be the one China. But it's interesting to see this as like a perspective. And then, this is kind of more like breakdown of growing up in Taiwan, on nationality, cultural traditions, Confucianism, bloodlines. I also wanted to know what unique challenges people felt in terms of their Taiwanese American identity. I will say I sort of had a survey design flaw here, so only a smaller portion of the survey respondents who checked off that they identify as other identity too got this survey, so there's less data here. But I think it kind of tracks generally with what I've seen from my previous survey, is that conflation of Taiwanese and Chinese, always having to explain that to people. Taiwan doesn't have international recognition, doesn't have a seat at the United Nations. There's misinformation about Taiwan, cross-strait issues, Taiwanese American or Taiwanese isn't on the U.S. Census, language issues, and identity issues. And then here, this is also interesting, is the conflation of Taiwanese and Dongguoren, a person from China versus Chinese ethnicity. And then also tracks that Taiwan doesn't have a seat at the United Nations, lacks international recognition, and cross-strait issues. And then this is kind of like a combination of the two. I'm gonna wrap up soon, but just a few things that people wrote in their narrative responses. I will say in the English survey, people were much more verbose and expanded upon their answers versus the Chinese survey. I had much shorter responses. So there's a lot more nuance to the narrative responses here. But Taiwan's own country, title, national flag, all have big issues, meaning controversial issues. and people don't understand Taiwan's history of foreign occupation, or are confused and don't understand the complexity. And then somebody else also said that the identity of Taiwanese and Taiwanese American is fairly new as an identity. And so having to educate people about that is a challenge. And then I also asked people what Taiwanese American means to you. I will say that there was a lot more nuance in the English responses in terms of being part of the Taiwan diaspora, being a Taiwanese national, a lot more on identity evolution than in the Mandarin. Was just like, I'm proud. I'm proud. I mean, I would say a lot of responses were like pride, love Taiwan and America, grew up in Taiwan, but live in the US. Much more straightforward responses, whereas there was a lot more, I think, struggle in the English responses that I would talk about. And then some also feel like this means that they support Taiwan independence, resist China, oppose totalitarian bullying. They're neither Zhongguoren nor Huaren. So they're rejecting both the being a person from China and being of Chinese ethnicity as well. And then there was a lot of freedom, dignity, democracy, and human rights, diversity, and inclusion in the Mandarin responses too, as to what it means to them to be Taiwanese American. And then just quickly wanted to mention the U.S. Census campaign on, check other Asian, write in Taiwanese. And I think this has actually helped strengthen this Taiwanese American identity in the last decade or so, or two. It's also been very interesting seeing in headlines the use of the words Taiwanese American, especially in light of, I would say in the last year, I've been seeing it a lot. There was a shooting in May of last year in Orange County, and there's been a lot of articles about Taiwanese American identity after that time. And that is really what prompted me to get back into this work myself. And so that was interesting to see in the media. And then just more, I feel like every day I see some headlines on Taiwan and U.S. Taiwan relations, criticizing Speaker Pelosi for visiting Taiwan, missile threats to Taiwan, the U.S. approving arms sales to Taiwan. So we've been seeing a lot more of that in the media lately. Some data points, I did ask about religion in my survey, but in the interest of time, left that out. But there are additional data points that I didn't survey, like where the person was located, their gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, education background, more details on their family background, their immigration history to Taiwan and the United States, as well as other identity markers that I think would be helpful, but I also wanted to balance not having so long of a survey, which I did ask actually all of these things. And the last one, you were like, I'm so tired. This is very long. You're asking too many questions. And then it was nice to see some responses to the survey, that they felt heard to take the survey and share their experiences and have been thinking about these issues. So I appreciated the gratitude that people gave. And my next steps are to get the survey out more widely so I can get more responses, and we appreciate all of your help in getting it out. Interviewing respondents, journalists, policymakers, scholars, and others in the field, reviewing more of the media reports and kind of linking that to the mention of Taiwanese identity or Taiwanese American identity, and then looking at U.S. Taiwan policy developments. So that's it for me. Happy to field any questions folks have, and then also ideas for further exploration. This is a work in progress. I do anticipate this being a multi-year project, maybe the rest of my lifetime. I don't know, but since it's outside of my paid job, it's taking a bit longer to get where I want.
Thank you so much for that, Christine. Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay. All right. First of all, I want to also express my gratitude for this project and this research. One of my areas is Asian American studies, and within that field, Taiwanese Americans are never named right, as a subfield, as a topic of inquiry. So this is a really important research gap that your work has really initiated, and I appreciate that. In addition to the context that your work in public-facing venues during moments such as the Laguna Woods shooting, I think it's important to have that visibility in historical context, even in difficult times. So I just want to express that again, that appreciation. A few things that I just want to note that I found very intriguing. I think the outline of the different emphases and depth between the English and Mandarin iterations of the survey. I think that was a very intriguing insight. We kind of laughed about the food thing, but I actually think we should put a pin in that. That is an important area for future inquiry in terms of soft power and collective cultural identity. There's also this question of generational difference, geopolitics, and certain forms of geopolitical awareness. Like, where does this sense of solidarity or community belonging come from? And so I think that's a really fascinating aspect of this research. Let's see. One thing that I will just say as just for context as well, I also do identify as Taiwanese American. We grew up in our household speaking Taiwanese, that was our home language. It was not until the census effort to say write in Taiwanese American that it became even possible for me to imagine, oh, I'm not really, I can think of myself as being a Taiwanese person, like it didn't click. So I think there is some ways that the grassroots movements can shape the formation of a coalescing Taiwanese identity, as you put it, that are kind of, there, right? Part of it's a bean counting effort for getting on the radar for advocacy work and political representation. Part of it is also just, hey, we just like belonging to this group, and so thank you for these insights. All right, so now I'd just like to open things up for questions from the audience, or actually, first of all, Christine, do you want to respond to any of that first? And then we can open things up for the audience.
Great. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for your thoughts. That was, and all of your guidance for the last year. I did want to have one other point I wanted to make, and that's like, I'm calling this a coalescing Taiwanese American identity because it's still like kind of happening. And I also think that it's more of a coalescing of the term and recognition of a Taiwanese American identity, but that the how people identify may actually vary, as you can see in the survey respondents. And the factors that impact one's Taiwanese American identity, whether it's the Taiwanese part, the Taiwanese part, the American part, or the combined portion, has different factors and may be different. You can see that there were some very opposing political viewpoints. So I'm not saying that everyone who's Taiwanese American has this viewpoint or this identity. It's more that the name Taiwanese American is shared by many people who might share different viewpoints and affiliations, but have decided that that is a term that does apply to them. So I wanted to just make that point. And it's not coalesced, it is like coalescing and an ongoing thing right now. But I'm open to questions.
I don't have a question, but I do have a recommendation. I think I actually feel one of the
So could you just identify yourself just because?
Well, my name is Bill. I'm from the North America Taiwanese Professor Association. Well, my recommendation to you will be, in our groups, this particular population, we're not used to filling out all those questionnaires. People look like I'm going to try to steal money from me. You ask me to personal question. So I think it to be more specific. I think you did some right approach, which means you get into our community. That's how I got somebody who I know referred you to me. Okay, just say, you know what I'm saying? So that's how I feel it. So I think what you might want to do to focus on our community, send it to me, I'll send it to a lot of folks, with me, and you'll get a lot of people who will respond to your request. Then your data looks much, much better. That's my only recommendation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I did also include in the survey that I didn't want to make any questions required because I knew that some people didn't want to give their date of birth. You know, so some of the data isn't exact. There might have been 685 survey responses, but not 685 responses for every single question, because I do respect people's personal information. And I do definitely I've been trying to send it through personal networks. I do want to get it beyond my own personal networks and my parents' personal networks too, so that I get a more diverse viewpoint though. So I think that is the challenge, getting it widely, but having people like trust that this person isn't using it or misusing it, the information. But thank you for that suggestion and recommendation.
I didn't see. So I think that would be that it does those two during the time was time frame.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have been looking at those resources too, of the history of the evolution of like a Taiwanese identity. And we'll continue. And I do want to read your thesis. So I'll get that from you.
Hey, my name is Julian Anderson. I am a senior at GW, and I had a wonderful opportunity to intern with Congressman Ted Lieu, one of the only two, I think, Taiwanese American congresspeople right now, and he's very, very proud of his Taiwanese American heritage. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the key important items for political representation of Taiwanese Americans, in Congress, or what political issues do you think Taiwanese Americans should care about or are going to be voting for?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I've been actually thinking about this a lot and in the approaches. And Jonathan and I have had these conversations too. So as an immigration attorney, I would say that some of the Congress people that are more sympathetic to asylum seekers, immigrants, are the ones that are more or less sympathetic to Taiwan, and then vice versa. And so part of what I want to do is educate people. You can't just look at the representative or the senator, but you really need to distill and understand the issue. Understand the issues more clearly. And I do feel like Taiwanese American politicians could help with some of that in terms of distilling why it's important to adopt policies between U.S. and Taiwan, but then also why immigration is important, because that's an issue I care a lot about. But I think that that's been a challenge for me. Like the same person that I actually think is, and I'm not going to name them right now, but that I think might be despicable on immigration issues is somebody that is actually, I would really love to talk to about U.S. Taiwan relations. And how do I navigate that? I've been talking about some of this with some of my colleagues, and I'll say, so-and-so is actually really good on Taiwan issues, but what would you think if you saw that he or she supported this bill? Would you vote for it, or would you be in support of it? And they say no. And I'm like, well, do you know anything about that issue? No. But then when I give the example for Taiwan and then immigration, they're like, oh, that's really interesting. So that I feel like that's something that I really want to explore more. And how do we navigate that when you're in front of a legislator that has diametrically opposed issues to issues that you care about? But I'm also curious to hear others' thoughts on what Taiwanese American politicians can move things forward.
My name is Alan. I want to ask you a question about the economic prosperity among the Taiwanese American ethnic groups, and based on the API ethnic groups, like and the incomes, like the survey, Taiwanese Americans are either the first or the second highest income group wise based on the like their family income. And we like in terms of the semiconductor industry, we know people like Morris Chang and Lisa Su for the high profile CEOs of worldwide or of like a very big semiconductor companies worldwide. And what could have led to this? My question is, what could have led to this economic prosperity among the Taiwanese Americans? What is like Taiwanese Americans' advantage in that?
I mean, I don't know that I have all of the information to answer that question adequately. I do know that when you're looking at immigration data and immigration from Taiwan, a lot of the Taiwanese Americans are more highly educated, come with higher education, professional degrees, and so also may then end up having higher income jobs. I will say that in my survey responses that I've received in both 2017 and the more recent surveys, people who are of lower economic backgrounds who identify as Taiwanese American do feel marginalized. And they actually do say that. They say like, you know, oftentimes I go to a Taiwanese event, but I don't feel welcome because other people seem to have a higher socioeconomic status or higher education status. And some of them are even embarrassed to attend some Taiwanese American events because they feel like they might be stigmatized.
Can you say something? I think it is probably not entirely fair to differentiate from one group to the other. Because like people like us, we were educated in here, so we pretty much work from Monday to Friday. The people who come in, they have to run a restaurant and somebody else. They do not have the luxury. So while we're having some party, they are making a living. So you cannot blame one way or the other. It's just sometimes it's hard. I try to tell people who are not in our pretty much in our category. I try to tell them it's we're all the same. But I think it's hard because it's not quite the same in a way. Even though we are all from the same area, but just different lifestyle. So it's sometimes just like basic air. I mean.
My name is Mason Simon, I'm a sophomore at GW. I have a question. If you ask any Taiwanese American their thoughts on the checkered past of Chiang Kai-shek when it comes to Taiwanese Americans' identity, when you're proud of one side, but about the same time, you have to acknowledge the fact that the ROC committed many atrocities.
Yeah, so that came out quite a bit. And the survey I did in 2017 actually explores more of that in terms of political identity and their political views in the United States, as well as like political views of the status of Taiwan. And a lot of people do mention the pieces. And there's more nuance actually in this survey too about the violations, human rights violations in Taiwan, understanding that. I think one thing is clear that a lot of people don't know the history either. And so that's a huge gap. And it's only when they've learned more about the history that they then shift from either perhaps identifying as Chinese American before or just American into wanting to identify more as Taiwanese American. And then I think it's also complicated too. Some people also mentioned that they have one parent who is has been, their family has been in Taiwan for 400 years. The other parent's family came to Taiwan with the KMT. And then that there is some tension amongst those family members too. But I think what I am seeing, and I'm going to break down the data further, but I think what I am seeing is that in the generation that is probably born in the 90s, 2000s, are identifying more as Taiwanese American identity or a Taiwanese identity, even if despite what their family background is, but that they have more roots in Taiwan. And then they have more understanding as well of the history of Taiwan.
Yeah, could the Japanese colonization of Formosa play a huge role in shaping this Taiwanese identity?
It does for the older generation. I think it's more removed for the generation now. But I did read a lot of the biographies of folks who grew up under Japanese colonial rule, and then the KMT, the nationalists as well. And they do talk about the transformation, because they said, at first I thought I was Japanese, and then I identified as being Chinese. And then I suffered all of these terrible atrocities and felt like my rights were being violated. And I'm now identifying as Taiwanese. So you do see that shift over time too, of confusion of identity. But I think that is rooted more in folks who are of previous generations, not present day. Yeah. But that does influence also, like, the descendants as well.
I'm Dave Ruth, the retired Foreign Service.
Good to meet you.
Let me follow on that conversation you and I had earlier. Do I understand that you weren't keeping track of the age of people that you were interviewing? Because one of the things that strikes me is the KMT immigration rules up to about early 1960 is that only Waishanran could come to the States. So Waishanran couldn't come until the 70s. And so if you're talking to an older group, you're talking to a real Chinese group. Whereas if you're talking to Waishanran later on, I can imagine they would have a different
opinion. Yeah, no, I did keep track of, I asked for the year of birth. I think in a previous iteration of a survey, I had asked for a month, date, and year, and people are like, whoa, that's too much identity. So I just asked now for the year of birth. So I did track that. For these, I didn't ask about immigration status and when they came to the United States. I did that in my 2017 survey, but I think that we also have to look at that data as well. But there are folks that immigrated later on to the United States too. I think from that period that you're referring to, that do identify as Benson Ren, that their families have been in Taiwan for many years.
I'm a section. I moved in Taiwan, but I went to college in the US. I have two questions. My first question sort of builds upon this family background, and also my family that immigrated to Taiwan in the would you collect any data on people that did not self-identify as Taiwanese American, but they lived with their place of birth as and my second question is about distinction between Chinese ethnicity and China identity. So Gongboard versus Wada. Speaking to some elderly Taiwan, including my family, I hear my grandfather using the Taiwanese identity, Taiwan, and Chinese identity interchangeably. And I noticed when he uses Gongboard, sort of associates that with the cultural aspect of Gongboard rather than of the Chinese identity, rather than the modern day nation state association.
Yeah, so I'll address the first question first. So in terms of, the first question of the survey is, do you self-identify as Taiwanese American? If you say no, you're disqualified from it. I don't collect any other data because I was only interested in those that self-identified as Taiwanese American. I wasn't going to pick for people what their identity is, but so I didn't collect any additional data. And I think that that's an interesting point and nuance that I feel like is hard to get at with the Zhongguoren, Huaren, and the translation of Chinese into English. And I don't know, to be really honest, because I'm not surveying people in Taiwan, if they make as much of the some people do still do the interchangeable, but I think it's going to be dependent on your political background too, and how you will identify. Because when I asked my dad, actually, like, okay, how shall I translate Chinese here, right? Should I do Huaren, Zhongguoren? He's like, well, for the most part, self-identified Taiwanese Americans are going to probably call themselves Zhongguoren, because they're going to think of that as a citizen of China. But Huaren, yes, there's going to be quite a few people that still have the ethnic identity. And I think for some folks too, is your grandfather still in Taiwan?
My grandfather immigrated to
US.
in the 1970s. Went back after staying here for years.
Okay. Because I think for some of those folks too, like they've changed their mind, and that's where some of the survey respondents too say that they did refer themselves as Zhongguoren when they lived in Taiwan, and even when they first came here to the United States, because they would also attend the Chinese student associations. Since there weren't really, like, a lot of people immigrated in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there weren't as many like Taiwanese American associations, so they would join the Chinese associations. And then I think in conversation with those people, interaction with people from mainland China, they realize that they have a different identity and they don't find that they are Zhongguoren. And then they learn more about the history of Taiwan. And, like, honestly, understanding some of the history of Taiwan is very new. And in terms of, like, Taiwan was under martial law until 1987. So that's still fairly, not that long ago. I mean, it occurred in my lifetime, but so, people are still learning about Taiwanese history. And so it takes a while too for the identity evolution.
Can I add one more? Since you mentioned the Taiwanese, when I was a kid, going to school, if I speak my native Taiwanese, I get punished. It's a financial penalty and a disgrace. They put a sign on your check saying, I spoke my dialect. That's how we became Chinese. That we were taught. I've learned my Chinese in the first grade. I never know how to speak Chinese, but my Chinese is good because I spent almost 15, 16 years learning Chinese. And that's why our Taiwanese, sometimes they got mixed up. They thought they were Chinese. I only realized it when I came to the state. Then I realized I started mingling with these folks. I said, oh my God, they already lied to me for 40 some years. It suffers psychological. I think I have like a PTS from the KMT government. I do.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think that there's a lot of people who share those viewpoints that also came out in the survey. There is a range though of how people have experienced what they went through when living in Taiwan.
And I'll just piggyback on a point that was made. Actually, I do think, from some of those answers that there is also some ambivalence that you can have pride in your cultural identity and also be grappling with the history as well. So I think, what I think is so rewarding about the qualitative survey, open-ended, is you generate some of those complexities, right, in those self-narrated responses. So I think that grappling with that complexity, I think, is a benefit of the way this survey is set up. I hope so. Anyways.
Hi, Richard. I wanted to ask about extending this work onward. I myself am Puerto Rican, and so when I see on these survey results, I feel a lot of there could be a lot of parallel exploration in any other communities in the U.S. So I'm wondering, kind of extending this further, do you foresee this to be used in conjunction with other Native American groups or local groups in the U.S. that may experience similar inflations of ethnicity, politics, civics, and we're working to go there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I would like to look at parallel identities as well and adapting to different contexts in the future. Again, I think that's probably more like for me a decade away at the pace that I'm working. I mean, right now I'm feeling like I really want to try to dig in more on the Taiwanese American identity and explore whether or not having a Taiwanese American studies program at various universities is something that can be established, because I do think it's really important. I think from the research I've done and from speaking to folks, a lot of people feel like they were marginalized, and this comes out a little bit less in this quick presentation, that they were all lumped in with Asian Americans or Chinese Americans. And even somebody who was the president of one of the North American Asian Pacific Islander groups, when I spoke to him, I'm doing the survey on Taiwanese American identity, what are your thoughts? He's like, oh, that's a really political topic. There's a reason why Taiwanese Americans aren't mentioned in Asian American studies, because that's very sensitive. And it's like, what? We need to be better than that. Especially if we're saying we represent Pan-Asian American studies and programs and associations. And so I think there is a lot of nuance in the written responses from people saying that even just saying I'm Taiwanese or Taiwanese American is a political statement in some ways. And so I think that there's a lot more to be said about that and other identities that people identify with, even if they're born in a certain place, that would be really interesting to look at. But I think my focus for now will be more on kind of uplifting Taiwanese Americans, and then kind of when that is a little bit more solidified, do more comparative analysis.
Well, thank you very much. I am noticing, looking at the clock, that we are in time. So thank you for this wonderful presentation and for thinking through some possible options for the future. Thank you for everybody for sharing your experiences and for these wonderful questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, I do want to mention that we have a program coming up on May 12th, cross-strait relations. And in that, one of the topics is changing and evolution of identities in Taiwan and its impact on cross-strait relations. So more identity is on your agenda. You can come on the 12th.
Thank you.
I think I just thank you all.
That is a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
Primary data collection is not easy. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for having me, and thanks for coming.
Yeah, good luck with this. It's really kind of pathbreaking stuff that
Yeah.
you're doing.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.